because God might be calling us to something truly extraordinary. And I don't mean that in a way to entice people. I mean that obedience to God is the most extraordinary thing we could do. That's the divine life. That's participating in the all holy Trinity, right? That's the life of God and the soul of man is through humility and obedience. And so sitting down and thinking, how much of this is me, and how much of this is actually what God has called me to, is just something which is so lacking in the contemporary Christian ethos, just in the zeitgeist of our culture in general. And so we need things like this, and we need more so priests who are qualified to do this kind of work of discernment with the people who are entrusted to our care.
Hello and welcome to the Anglican Renaissance podcast. My name is Joe. This is on the Young Anglican YouTube channel. If you're watching this is my guest, Father Brandon LeTourneau. Father Brandon is a priest out in California. If I think you may have seen his Twitter. He's a very beautiful church called St. Mark's that he is the rector at. Without further ado, is there anything else you'd like to let the audience know about you and your ministry, Father Brandon?
Not especially. I feel like I'm a fairly typical priest, and there are probably others more worthy of your attention.
Oh, that's not true. All right. But we've got good things to talk about today. What I wanted to start with is both of us came into Christianity, specifically Anglican Christianity, from Judaism. And I gather that you have a pretty interesting story, although I've never heard it before. So I'm excited to get to know just your journey with God and with Anglicanism and then into ministry.
Sure. I mean, coming from Judaism, I was raised religious, as you could probably guess, and raised in I guess you could say, a very studious faith. If you have any kind of Jewish identity, like study as a virtue, you've probably been hitting the books for quite a while. Uh, so, long story short, I really became kind of fascinating with Christianity proper in high school, really the end of high school. And I think that's the first time that I was surrounded by a lot of peers who were Christians, right? Especially in my junior year. And not just in a nominal sense, but very zealous Christians, very consistent Christians. And being the Jewish guy, they were also very zealous to convert me. There's evangelicals love Jews. I think I can leave it at that. And God bless them. They really, really, really wanted to see me give my life to Jesus, which was a concept that I did not quite understand. And the more I talked to them, the more infuriated I became with these conversations, because if you grow up Christian, you are so ignorant to Judaism that I don't think I could really stress that enough. That there are so many assumptions that are made about Judaism if you're Christian, that you're just not aware of. Like, Judaism is not Old Testament religion. Judaism is not Christianity without Jesus. And Judaism is an entirely other way of thinking and being and engaging with the scriptures, which I think are more foreign to evangelicals than they'd care to admit. So I'd have these conversations with my friends who would say things like, Jesus is the Messiah, right? But in their context, the only time a Christian ever hears the term Messiah is in connection with Jesus. So Messiah must be a fancy word for God, right? So they'd say Jesus is the Messiah, and I'd say, okay, and they'd say, therefore he's God. And I'd say, what are you talking about? This makes no sense. And so this frustration, actually, providentially, is what really encouraged me to study Christian theology proper on my own. The way I like to put it is, my evangelical friends were really good at starting conversations and really bad at finishing them. And when you've been studying theology since you're a little kid, again, studies of virtue, and this isn't an arrogance thing, this is just reality. They could not meet me in the intellectual space that I needed them to, or answer the kind of questions that I needed them to. And so I said, well, I'm just going to figure it out on my own, I suppose. So I kind of internally determined to figure out Christianity, and probably more arrogantly, almost to disprove it, in a sense. From my perspective, Christians were just really bad Gentiles trying to be Jews. Like that was kind of the framework I put it in. It's this really strange, perverse Judaism, and they don't quite know what they're doing. They don't even know the lingo, and so I'm gonna toss the goy a bone. I'm gonna help him out, and I'm gonna figure out what's going on. So I went to a Goodwill and I picked up a copy of Saint Augustine's Confessions, which was there for about 99 cents or so. And I knew the name St. Augustine because I had taken like a intro to Western philosophy class, Western Civ class, something like that. And so I knew that St. Augustine was a Christian. I also knew that he was supposed to be one of the really good Christians and probably worthy of my time, right? So this is probably the end of my high school career, probably the last couple weeks of high school, actually. And I remember finishing St. Augustine's Confession in the back of like my chemistry 2 class, just bawling. Uh, and I wasn't paying any attention to class, but that was fairly typical. I've always been a humanities kind of person. And, St. Augustine did not answer a single one of my questions. If you've read the Confessions, which you probably have, it's not that kind of book, right? It's autobiographical, it's very prayerful, it's beautiful. It's these very deep, rich meditations on the nature of God and sin and our relationship to God in our sin, right? And so I remember finishing it, setting it down, and thinking, well, I can't say that this was a worthless endeavor because clearly Augustine touched something, but it also did not make Christianity any clearer, even remotely. And on top of it, it gave me all this vernacular and terminology that I had no idea what to do with. Like, Saint Augustine talks a lot about the Manichaeans, and I was like, "What? What's a Manichaean?" Right? And I don't know what edition I had, but it did not have footnotes explaining the terminology. So I was like, "All right, I have to keep reading." St. Augustine, if you recall, in his Confessions, is really convicted by reading the life of St. Anthony. So he reads the life of St. Anthony, bursts out into tears, runs outside, hears the voice, tolle lege, runs inside, opens Romans, conversion experience. But it's the life of St. Anthony that leads up to that. And the life of St. Anthony, this life entirely consecrated to God, is what really, I think, exposes his duplicity to himself. And he's like struck with this conviction, right? So I was like, well, I should probably read the life of St. Anthony if it's having such a powerful effect in him. And I read the life of St. Anthony. And it's interesting. Like, if you haven't read the life of St. Anthony, you should. It's got demons in it. It's got all kinds of weird stuff. Uh, did not answer any of my questions because it's not that kind of book, right? It's biographical. St. Anthony going out into the wilderness, hearkening to the call of the gospel, right? St. Anthony walks into church and hears, "Sell all you have, give to the poor," and he says, "All right, I'll do it." Like that's the life of St. Anthony. And yeah, from my perspective, useless but definitely intriguing. So the life of St. Anthony is written by St. Athanasius, and so I was like, all right, I'm going to read this Athanasius guy. And then finally, here we start getting some traction because St. Athanasius writes treatises like on the Incarnation. And on the Incarnation, I bring up for a reason because he really kind of baby steps you through the gospel. And he asks questions like, is Christ man? Is he God? Does it matter that he's man? Does it matter that he's God, right? What is being accomplished in this scandalous claim that the Christian makes every Sunday that God became man, right? That he has dwelt among us, incarnatum est, that God has dwelt with us in our nature. And so I was like, these early Christians are making a lot more sense than my evangelical contemporaries. And, God bless them. I was like, so I need to stick with these guys. And so I became even more purposed in my desire to not convert, but to understand. Um, and so I decided I was going to read through all the Apostolic Fathers. And the town I grew up in has a great little Christian Bible college that has a terrific like summer book sale every year in their library where they just get rid of massive volumes in their catalog, and so you can find like wonderful things that an evangelical college doesn't want, but an inquiring Jew definitely wants. And so I was able to pick up Bishop Lightfoot's The Apostolic Fathers for just a couple bucks, right? providentially. So I read through the Apostolic Fathers. Um, Wonderful. A lot of it is kind of Christian insider baseball, right? Uh, but getting to St. Justin Martyr and his dialogue with Trifo, um, and it kind of felt like St. Justin was speaking to me because one, you can tell that St. Justin loves the prophets, right? That's a part of his biography. When he talks about his coming to the faith, it's through the prophets. It's the futility of Plato and the comfort and salvation he finds in the friends of God, the prophets, right? And so you know he loves the scriptures and he seems very acquainted with them. And it's from that perspective that he then engages with Trifo, this philosopher, rabbi figure, whoever he is, right? And it's so funny. I've been told on several occasions that that dialogue is anti-Semitic, and I did not feel that way at all in reading it because they both give and get. Like they're kind of trading blows and they're swapping their mastery of the scriptures. And for me, from a Jewish perspective, it feels very Jewish, right? And so that has never made sense to me. But I remember reading Saint Justin and the frustration that he feels with Trifo is that it seems like the Judaism of his day is constantly like moving the goalposts a little bit, where every time Christians say, like, look, here is Christ in the scriptures, the Judaism of his day says, well, we have actually never believed that, even if perhaps there was an older tradition that says precisely that, right? Um, and that was intriguing to me because I had just started encountering something very much like that in the contemporary Judaism, that I had experienced. And you probably know, but for those who don't know, there are within Judaism like counter missionary ministries, right? So just as there are Christian apologetics, there are Jewish apologetics as well, um, which should be expected, I suppose. And it's perfectly consistent to them. God bless them. Like it makes sense, right? And one of the counter Christian apologetics that I had heard quite frequently is that Jews do not believe in vicarious atonement. Vicarious atonement is unjust, right? You sin, you make up for your sin, and it's you and God dealing with your sins. Someone else can't do it. But something that I kept encountering like again and again and again and again and again, especially in older sources. I mean, not even older sources. You find this in medieval sources. You find this in Rashi, right? But these passages in famous commentaries on the Tanakh, or even in the Mishnah, of talking about a tzaddik, a righteous person, a saint, their death atoning for the camp, right? So there's famous passages exploring the death of Miriam that essentially says the death of Miriam teaches us that when she died, she atoned for Israel, right? Same thing with Aaron. When he died, he atoned for Israel in the way that the priestly garments atoned for Israel, right? I was like, this is vicarious atonement, right? And same with in the Mishnah, there's a story about Moses speaking to God, speaking to Hashem, and he asks God, what are my people to do when they no longer have a temple, right? And Hashem responds and says, I'll raise up a righteous one from among them, and he will atone for the camp, right? I was like, this is sounding weirdly Christian, right? It's vicarious atonement. It sounds like the temple is not permanent, which we know, like we've had a couple iterations to know that it's not permanent, and but also when it is not there, it's not just the righteous. It seems like there is a righteous person who will atone for it, right? And the Mishnah is very old, right? If the traditions surrounding the Mishnah are correct, like this is a very old tradition, right? Even if it was written down later. So um, this really pushed against this apologetic that I had heard quite frequently, that I still see actually, that like Jews simply do not believe in vicarious atonement, but we do, right? We absolutely do. So it was providential that I was reading St. Justin and also experiencing this in the life of the Judaism around me at the time. It was like, whoa, okay, there's something here, and Justin is noticing something. And like I have to be careful. There are people who have taken this and said, oh, lying, sneaky Jews constantly. Like, that's not it at all. It's just there's something within the tradition here that Saint Justin is noting, and I'm experiencing that thing that he's taking notice of. And it was highlighting a distinction to me between Christianity and Judaism that I think a lot of people don't notice, and that is in Christianity, um, strict continuity is a virtue, right? Contend for the faith once delivered, right? Where in Judaism, progress is almost a virtue. Like later halakhic rulings can outweigh earlier ones, right? Later interpretations can outweigh earlier ones. And this strict refusal to deviate that you find enshrined within the church is not there in the same way. Um, Especially since Judaism is not dogmatic in the way that Christianity is, right? There's no creed in Judaism. You have Maimonides famously wrote 13 principles, which some synagogues recite as a creed, but it is not the same as our creed, and we don't even have the one creed. We have three. If you're Anglican, you have three creeds, right? That we die for, right? Uh, and so there's a very different approach to what's happening here. And so, anyway, as long as I'm going to keep digressing, but uh, by the time I got through St. Justin and the rest of the Apostolic Fathers, right, I've been out of high school a while now. I'm probably about 19. And I've read a little bit around them as well. I read C.S. Lewis at this point, Mere Christianity and such. And someone gave me Bonhoeffer. I read Bonhoeffer, which was really fun. The Cost of Discipleship and his ethics. And I was convinced of the Christian claims. I was convinced of the Christian claims. Um, there was some muddiness to get through for a while. I encountered Messianic Jews very quickly. Immediately became frustrated with them. God bless them. I know some people who'd use that designation, but I've still yet to meet a Messianic Jew who's actually Jewish. Uh, and I know they exist. I'm sure they exist. And I'm sure there are perfectly consistent, intelligent individuals who are part of that movement. I just have not met them, right? And it just it just seemed like they didn't know Christianity or Judaism, right? And so I like to say they just seemed like they were ignorant in two religions. Uh, so it was incredibly frustrating for me. Um, but because all my friends were charismatic, that's where I went. I went to the big charismatic church, and God bless them. They were so pastorally sensitive to me and welcomed me with so much love that every every event I went to at this church, every single one, they made sure there was a kosher option for me. Even after becoming a Christian and throughout my inquiry, I never stopped eating kosher, right? And even still, like I don't keep strict kashrut, but like unkosher food like messes with my stomach. Like I just don't think I have the enzymes or something because I don't have it. So um, sorry. Uh, so like God bless them, so kind to me, so hospitable in the way that they engaged with me, and they helped me, believe it or not, like work through a bunch of heresies because I'm trying to synthesize, right? And I haven't really been introduced to the great synthesizers of the church. I've never heard of Nicaea, right? And I've read almost exclusively like ante-Nicene fathers, right? And so, like, I didn't know the Nicene Creed. I don't know what the Trinity is or how we speak or don't speak about the Holy Trinity. Um, and so they had this really phenomenal youth pastor there who really kind of took me under his wing, and he catechized me in a very subtle, gentle way to the point that I didn't even realize I was being catechized. And to his credit, he would have me memorize important dates and figures in the church. Like in the ancient church, I had to memorize the dates of the ecumenical councils. Um, I had to know what heresies they dealt with, which you would not get from just about any Pentecostal church that I'm aware of. So I think providentially God placed him there for me because this was the kind of formation that I needed. But yeah, and he'd quiz me too in like casual conversation. Be like, oh, Brandon, when was the Council of Nicaea? Like 325. Which heresy? Arian, right? Uh, and in a very subtle, friendly way, baby stepped me through the faith, and it's exactly what I needed. Um, I I once challenged him publicly, basically to say that like Christ was not God. I was in my Arian phase, right? And Christ is like a God, right? And I never heard of Arius. This is just it's interesting how I came to almost exact conclusions, but uh, uh, and he gave me exactly what I needed, which was to utterly humiliate me with the scriptures in front of me. Because I challenged him very publicly, and he very publicly wiped the floor with me, which is what I should have expected because I had barely been reading the Bible, for a while, the New Testament, I should say. I hadn't known it super well, so um, and I need tough love, and he gave it to me. So they baptized me according to what I call the charismatic rite, which is in his swimming pool. Uh, and, um, but it wasn't much longer into my early adult life. I was probably about 20 years old. It's about a year after this baptism at 19 was I discovered Presbyterianism through there was a kind of an ecumenical Bible study where a number of different guys who I knew from different churches would get together and they'd read the scriptures together. And one of these guys who was attending, two of them actually were were Presbyterians, and I'd never heard of such a thing. And they invited me to their church, and I loved it. Right? It wasn't particularly liturgical. Like, it wasn't like PCA or anything like that. There was no or CREC or anything like that. It was just a very dignified. They wore the Presbyterian vestments, which is a blazer and khakis, and my pastor though was probably one of those brilliant men I've ever met in my entire life. He could preach for an hour without repeating himself, right? There was no doubling back. There was no reiterating. It was just new content for an hour straight as he exegeted these passages. And he knew his languages, man. He could go in Latin and Greek and Hebrew and really pull apart the text in a way that I had not experienced a lot of within the church. And even though they weren't particularly liturgical, there was still a standing for the reading of the word, which I really appreciate, this deep reverence for the Word of God. And they sang the doxology at the end of every service. So that's actually where I learned the doxology. Yeah, I know. Not where you would expect someone would learn the doxology. I've since learned that that's actually pretty common in many Presbyterian circles. So interesting. I would not have guessed that a couple months ago. But so that's where I learned the doxology. But I became dissatisfied with Presbyterianism um, because about a year there, like good Presbyterians, they had Sunday school, which is an extra hour of lecturing after the service on Sunday, right? So everyone sticks around, and the pastor or some elders will then go into a study series of some kind. And you're not expected to be there, but you're kind of expected to be there, right? And so everybody was there, and I won't say his name, but one of the elders of the church, God bless him, was doing a series on the church fathers, and it was the church fathers who led me into the faith, right? These are my guys, so I was particularly excited about this. And he he got through the series, and it was good for the most part, right? He does not have any degrees in theology or anything like that, so um, well, I don't need to disclose who he is or what he does, but anyways, this was not his discipline, and what he was giving was good information. And when we got to the end, in the last service, the last Sunday school was a Q&A, and so it was just open to questions, whoever's interested. So I raised my hand. I've been waiting for this, and I asked him in good faith. Right, this wasn't a gotcha. From my perspective, I thought there was some reason that I was ignorant of, and I was hoping he could connect a couple dots to me. And that was, in particular, why Saint Justin Martyr says that the deacons take the reserved sacrament to the poor, the shut-in, the sick, etc. And the Westminster Standards are pretty clear, and many Protestant denominations are like this. That if you miss the consecration, you just miss it, right? We don't reserve the sacrament. We especially do not take it to the sick, right, or anything like that. And that's not the work of deacons, right? Because we had deacons in our church, they didn't do anything like that, right? And I'll never forget. He said, "Oh, that's easy," and the flood of relief that came over me. I was like, "Oh, good, it's easy." And he says, "Justin was wrong," and he just moved on. And I remember thinking, "All right, I can't be here." Justin Martyr is the one. Like, I owe my soul to Justin Martyr, and I've learned a bit more at this point. Like, Justin Martyr is the first description of a Christian service we have outside of the scriptures, right? Scriptures, Didache, and then like Justin, like that's it, right? So if Justin says this is what we're doing. Like, this is probably what we're doing. Where did we feel like we could deviate was the question I was asking. And I had assumed there was some kind of robust Christian halacha on why you could deviate that I was ignorant of, right? And no, Justin was just wrong. and, so providentially, I had a buddy who had been going to Wheaton, and for some class he took at Wheaton, he had to buy a Book of Common Prayer, and I'll never forget. He gave me a copy once he was done with his class, and this is about right before I left Presbyterianism. And he said, "Oh, I know you miss the synagogue liturgy. Here's a Christian liturgy." I said, "There are Christian liturgies, right?" Like, nobody told me this, uh, you know. And so I just read through the Book of Common Prayer in a day. I actually think he gave me two because I had a 1662 and I had a 79, and I just read through them, right. And I was just found it so beautiful, and I was like, Lord, where's a church that I can go to that is like this? Literally the next day, almost, well, not almost, by Providence, uh, I walk into probably my favorite coffee shop at the time, and I see a man there in a collar, right? And there's two things I know about my hometown, and that's one, the Lutherans do not wear collars, uh, and two, I have never seen a Roman Catholic priest outside of his church, ever. I don't know if they use tunnels or if they always switch into, like, maybe they just always put on their like casual clothes if they go outside. But I take it back. I have since met the Roman Catholic priest in my area because I'm now very close to where I grew up, my parish is, and he was just in a t-shirt and jeans outside. So I think he just changes, right? But that's it. So I've never seen a Roman Catholic priest in a collar outside, and the Lutherans do not wear collars in my area. And so the odds are this is an Anglican priest, right? And then I wasn't aware of Orthodoxy at the time, but no Orthodox priest around here would wear a Western collar like that either that I'm aware of. So, uh, God forgive me, he was doing some kind of pastoral meeting, and I probably shouldn't have been eavesdropping, but he was meeting with a parishioner, and so I actually sat with like my back to him, so that I could, like, at the table behind him, so that I could listen. Like, oh, he was an Anglican priest, and so actually, while I was in the coffee shop, I like found him on Facebook. We had a friend of a friend. I like sent him a message. I don't think he knew I was sitting right next to him. I sent him a message. I was like, "Hey, can we get coffee? I'd love to chat about Anglicanism." And he's like, "Yeah, absolutely, right." And so we got coffee the next day at the same coffee shop that we were at. And yeah, I don't think he had any idea that I was sitting right behind him. And I was confirmed in 2015, I think. And so I've been Anglican ever since. Anglicanism has been I guess, the majority of my Christian experience proper, actually knowing what Christianity is and believing it. And so I've been Anglican for about a decade now, just about, and then now I'm a priest. Yeah, so I know that was a lot of expositions. That's how I came into the faith. And I guess long story short is I wanted to be a rabbi when I was younger, and I ended up becoming a priest. So
Yeah, I loved hearing that story. If I could get you to go on longer, I would have. But I think there were so many interesting little parallels. As someone who also was raised Jewish and thinking about like how the emphasis on study, and then also once becoming Christian, still having all of my own little pet heresies that I kept with me and like insisted that I knew better than everybody else was telling me that
oh
it was
yeah,
heretical.
I can
Yeah,
fix the faith.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, I
I get
had my weird opinion was because I got really into the like dating of the Gospels and whether or not they're
it. Okay,
authentic because like Jews for Judaism organization, like Tovia Singer will be like the Gospels aren't reliable,
sure.
and so then I got really into that, and then I was like, okay, the Synoptic Gospels I trust. It's the Gospel of John. I don't know if that's inspired. And I remember
Uh,
having a conversation with people about that.
do did Jews for Jesus ever reach out to you?
They didn't reach out to me, but I watched some of their content. Like Michael Brown, I think he's affiliated with them.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah. He's a Baptist. I
yeah.
only ask 'cause I don't know who keeps reporting me, but I've moved several times, and every time, like, Jews for Jesus tracks me down, and I get their letters. I'm on
That's
some
so
kind of
funny.
watch list. I must.
That's hilarious. I love it. Okay, Amazing story. I love that your interest in the liturgy. Another parallel too was I remember going to from synagogue that I grew up in, then going to an evangelical church when I first became Christian, and I was dressed in a suit and tie and like ready for like to sit for 3 hours
Yeah,
and everything, and they were all in like flip flops and t-shirts,
yeah,
and I was very confused. And I do remember thinking like I kind of missed the liturgical aspect of worship that I was used to as a kid.
oh yeah,
um, I kind of imbibed also though briefly imbibed the whole like, well, actually that stuff is bad.
yep,
Kind of like liturgy is not good for you because it's like rote prayer and all that kind of stuff.
yep,
And I was like, oh, okay, interesting. Um, so overcoming a lot of stuff is it takes time,
yep.
but I'm glad to hear that you ended up in Anglicanism. I'm glad that there was an Anglican priest in your town who you could talk to and work through those issues. Um, Super cool to hear. So to talk about a little bit of transition, I think
Mm.
you talked about becoming a priest. You knew you wanted to become a priest because you're kind of a theological guy, always had been, was maybe wanted to be a rabbi. What what is the kind of I want to say just Christian, but Anglican specifically view on vocations and ministry and all those um, distinctives of pastoral ministry?
Yeah, I think the Reformation in general actually has a very deep emphasis on vocation, right? So to back up for you, and this isn't like a everything is Rome's fault rant or anything like that. But at the time of the Reformation, it was very common for people to be shoehorned into offices for the sake of greed, for the sake of ease, for the sake of stability in the family or society or whatever, right? And so a lot of the decrying of monasticism or even certain structures within the hierarchy of the church really have to do with an emphasis on godly vocation. I think even the Protestant distinctive of the godly prince, right? That person who's anointed by God to govern the people entrusted to their care is a fixation on vocation that they've received a call, and it is actually sinful to exchange that call or to jettison it for some other structure, right? So, for example, someone else with a different vocation stepping in and doing those things, right? So this is all over the reformers, right? Calvin has his frustration with like priests who don't preach, right? Like you have a vocation, you don't get to outsource that to other people, right? But this was common, right? And he's drawing on Saint Jerome there. So this is a very Catholic idea, but it is particular to the Reformation, and I think it manifests in a particular way in the Reformation, and I think this is actually baked into the Anglican tradition in a couple different ways. But first thing that comes to mind is the prayer book, right? Uh, Prayer being, liturgy, the work of the people, right? Not in the trite way that all of us have our own little parts to play in the liturgy, but it would be nice if the people are aware of it, if it's their work, right? Even if it's being done on their behalf, it'd be nice if they knew what was happening, right? So I think of Cranmer's preface to the prayer book that prayer had become so complicated, worship had become so complicated that the people engage. You have to have professionals to engage in it, which is so disheartening because it's prayer, right? It is this universal Christian vocation. It's like saying that holiness has become so complicated that you need professional holy people, right? It is so diametrically opposed to the gospel. It's so antithetical to the Christian life, where we all have this calling of prayer. We have this common vocation that we receive in holy baptism, right? Prayer is one of those things. Holiness is one of those things. And then God, by his providence, has also called us to our particular holiness, to a particular way of living, whether that is as a priest or a husband and father, a mother, or a king, right? The king has a particular duty because of the work of providence, electing them to be the one who sits in this office and having this really magnificent vocation, which is to steward the people of God entrusted to their care. And so all of this is kind of wrapped up into Anglicanism, and we see it coming out in many different places. We see it in the liturgy and the reform of the liturgy, which is really reforming back to an older, simpler liturgy. right? We see it in its approach to government and its approach to the working of the church, to the purity of the church. It means that people who are priests should probably be prepared to be priests, who are taking their vocation seriously, that they're qualified to be priests, that they're at a right age where you can make them a priest. Like no more children priests that are happening, right? I think St. Thomas talks about this. Like hypothetically, a child could be made a priest, something like that, right? And I'm sure it happened, right? You had child monks. I'm sure there were child priests as well. Although I can't give you a citation for that. I just can't. But I'm sure it happened. So, uh,
I think if I'm not mistaken, there are some Medici cardinals who were like 12 because
oh yeah,
they're
yeah, yeah.
so
That's
stuff like that did definitely happen. Yeah.
yeah. So like this is an abuse of the vocation. And even let's say it is that 12-year-old's vocation to be a cardinal. God bless him. Like let's say that's what God actually had called them to. Should they not prepare for it, right? We have Bishop Hooper's letters where what is it? When he became bishop, he sent out tests to all the clergy under his care. Very simple questions that any priest, any laity should be able to answer. And one of them that I'll never forget was, who wrote the Lord's Prayer? This is his question he asked his clergy. And the vast majority did not know who wrote the Lord's Prayer. Right? And so, like this is not walking out your godly vocation. Even if God bless them, these men were called to be priests. Should they not have prepared to be priests? Right? If you read the homily on the state of matrimony, it speaks in very similar ways. Right? The act of holy matrimony, entering into this marital covenant, this sacrament of marriage, is a holy endeavor that one has to prepare for, right? As the prayer book says, it should not be entered into unadvisedly, right? And it has to be entered into according to certain principles, right? That is the principles for which it was instituted, again what the prayer book says. That's true of all of our vocations, right? And this isn't new in the Christian life. St. John Chrysostom, his homily on marriages, speaks very, very similarly, right? So Anglicanism says we have a vocation. God in his providence has prepared this vocation for us. This vocation is the means of our subjective individual holiness, and we have to do the work of preparing for that vocation, right? If someone says, I saw the heavens opened, I saw the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Father, and he says to me, you shall be my priest, right? Therefore, I don't need to go to seminary. Therefore, I don't have to study Koine Greek. I don't have to take exams. I don't have to do any of those things, right? Because God has just told me. In fact, I don't even have to receive the laying on of hands because Christ has elected me to this, right? Which sounds absurd, but like this has happened in the life of the church, right? But what's crazy is Saint Paul doesn't do this. St. Paul literally saw the heavens opened and Christ called him as an apostle, and he still goes 3 years to prepare, and he still goes to the apostles to be received into the ministry, right? And so just having doing the work of discernment is not enough, but then actually preparing for the vocation that God has called us to is another thing. And I think Anglicanism really, really pushes this. If you're going to be married, you probably should have prepared to be married, and not in the carnal secular sense of getting your ducks in a row, finishing college, making sure you have the right bank account or whatever, but spiritually, are you prepared to do the spiritual labor that is marriage? Because your soul actually rests on it. That's what it means to have a vocation from God, is that it actually has a bearing on your soul, right? As a married priest, I will stand before God and I will have to answer back to him how I stewarded my marriage and how I stewarded my priesthood, these vocations that he gave me. And I can't say, well, God, you called me to it, therefore I just trusted you to do it, right? That's the sin of presumption, and it's not real. It doesn't work that way, right? So the Anglican tradition really speaks, I think, in a very broad, or I shouldn't say broad, in a very holistic way about this, which is simultaneously recognizing that we are supernaturally called to particular vocations within the life of the church, that the good of the church and the good of my soul rests upon my walking in this vocation. And because I am called to this by Almighty God, I must take it seriously, soberly, and with preparation, real preparation.
Yeah. I think you're totally right. I was shocked. I read the Augsburg Confession for the first time, and the insistence that every vocation has a godly aspect to it, and that there aren't superior vocations in a kind of heaven's view sense. And
Yeah.
um, it was super interesting to see that that was such a big deal. I think because
Yeah,
I mean, maybe that would have been a tertiary element of Lutheran theology to me compared to Roman Catholicism, but that was such an emphasis
yeah,
at the time of the Reformation.
yeah. I think it's
So
a characteristic of the Reformation. Yeah,
yeah, 100%. And you can imagine people assuming, oh, just because I have this title as a clergy, I'm therefore like guaranteed an easier
yeah,
spot in heaven than
yeah.
uh, other guys. I think um, I can't remember the examples he gave, but I remember being Luther does this as well. He gives examples of people who he thinks could be serving God better than clergy who don't take
Oh,
their
so
vocation seriously.
mhm. Well, I mean, it manifests in a lot of ways. Like, I think of Lewis in The Great Divorce, who, like, the most glorious figure he encounters in heaven is like this woman who's kind of treated poorly by her husband, but is so faithful to her vocation. He's like, is this the Blessed Virgin? No, it's just this glorious woman who's glorified because she walked out her vocation in the right way.
Absolutely, yeah. Okay, so talking about the theology of vocations in general, maybe even the theology of the vocations of ministry and marriage. Are we talked also a little bit about monastic vocations kind of going away in the Reformation and what was some of the skepticism there. Um, how has that developed in the time since the Reformation, especially in the Anglican way?
Yeah, so the loss of the monastic houses in the Church of England was really always pitied. It doesn't exactly seem to be the work of the bishops. If I recall, Ridley asked for one monastic house to be kept in every diocese, right? And so, unfortunately, you had a lot of abuses going on in those monastic houses, right? Everything from usury and robbery to obscene, like sexual acts taking place behind these closed quarters. But many of them were good, and there was a general recognition, right? Calvin acknowledges this. He says, like, yeah, I really have an issue with the Dominicans, not Dominic. He's like, if you were all like Saint Dominic, right? If you were all like Saint Francis, but you're not, like that's why I have an issue with these, right? And so the loss of the monastic houses was really kind of painful for the Church of England. And you have lots and lots of commentary on that. If you're really interested, Dr. Peter's book, Reforming the Monastery, he has a chapter on the Anglican view of monasticism going back to the time of the Reformation. But that whole book is quotations from the reformers and other Protestant divines about monasticism. And the general consensus is monasticism is good. There were abuses within monasticism. And so you have monastic like structures which come into place after the Reformation, like Little Gidding. But it doesn't take effect entirely until the Oxford movement, right? Um, which is I don't want to give all the credit to the Oxford movement because if you've read William Augustus Muhlenberg, and I love the Oxford movement, don't get me wrong, but if you read William Augustus Muhlenberg, right, he's definitely not Tractarian. He's the great evangelical Catholic, is what he calls himself. He actually has a more of a Lutheran upbringing than anything. He has two treatises on Protestant sisterhoods. And Sister Anne Ayres in the American Church is the first lifelong professed nun in the American Church, the Episcopal Church, and he's not even remotely Tractarian in his theology. I think he would struggle to equivocate the two. So there was something going on at the time, but just to say the Oxford movement did it, I think is probably going a leg too far. That said, around this time in the 19th century, you then have the reestablishment of these monastic houses. You have the reestablishment of these lifelong vows of celibacy that individuals could take for the purpose of remaining in service to God and the church.
Yeah. So what does that look like today for Anglicans, especially here in North America?
Um, it's a bit of a mixed bag. And it's a mixed bag not so much because it's Anglican, but because it's American. And what I mean by that is Americans have this visceral we die on this hill, we stick to our guns mentality, right? Which to begin with is just such violent language to describe anything. Really, it's very American, even those idioms. And so you have people who just go out and start their own third order, whatever, the Society of the Divine, God knows what. And then they go and they buy their robes, and now I'm a monk, now I'm a nun. And so this is quite common, especially with the advent of the internet. It's very easy to find a lot of people like this, and no disrespect to them. If you know if the robe helps you pray, God knows my robe helps me pray. You know, if that if that's what you need to make you pious, like God bless you. Um, but that is not monasticism proper. A monasticism without celibacy, a monasticism without the cost, right? Without a vow of poverty of some kind, right? Is not really monasticism proper. Um, that said, there are traditional monastic institutions within the life of the American church, some quite old, right? Like the Society of St. John the Evangelist, which is still running in the Episcopal Church, which was established by Father Benson and Bishop Grafton, which is a priestly society. I don't know if it still is, but originally I believe it was a priestly society. Um, or you have the Community of St. Mary, the Sisters of St. Mary, who are still, I think there are still two convents, one in the ACNA, one in the Episcopal Church, which are quite old, which are kind of baked into American history, right? You know the story of St. Constance and her companions, the martyrs of Memphis. They were of the Community of St. Mary. Um, I don't know if you're familiar with that story, but
Vaguely, I know of them because I think they're on the liturgical calendar.
they're on the liturgical calendar. What happens is yellow fever strikes out in Memphis, and everyone leaves except these Anglican nuns, and they stay to take care of the sick, and a good number of them die. But because of that, they're enshrined in the hearts and memory of everyone in Memphis. So many people died in Memphis that Memphis actually lost its cityhood for a minute. They just didn't have the population. And so these faithful nuns, these sisters of the Community of St. Mary, stuck around and prayerfully gave their lives over to the sickness in the pursuit of the service of God, but also through their neighbor. So um, it's amazing that that community still exists. And if people want, you can join that community, right? And you can live out a consecrated life in the community of a literal saint on our calendar.
Yeah. So, from what I understand, you're hosting, I think in November,
Yes.
in the Diocese of San Joaquin, a
Mhm.
conference on vocation. Tell us
Yes.
all about it.
Sure. So the idea is that vocation is multifaceted, and we have a tendency to think in binaries and black and white, especially if you're coming from an evangelical background, which many people in the ACNA are. If you're a gifted preacher or a teacher, you therefore must be a pastor, right? In the Anglican tradition, we have catechists. Right, we have deacons, we have priests. Right, we have a diversity of ministries, all of whom can preach in varying capacities and in different contexts, but each of them can. So to say, well, I'm called to preach, there's actually a layer of work of discernment that needs to be done there to determine actually how God is calling you to preach, right? In the same way, there is an assumption baked into 21st century culture, Western culture especially, which is that God wants me to have sex, right? I have a lot of discussions about spiritual direction and discernment, especially with young people in my parish, and even just the mention that what if God has called you to a single life, right? And the visceral response to the belief that, like, what do you mean that I could never have sex? That's impossible, right? Such a thing doesn't exist and is definitely not godly, right? And part of this is so contrary to the gospel, but even more so, it's really just contrary to human nature because Christianity is not the first institution to have celibacy. We are not the first institution to have monasticism. We're still not the only institution. What this means is that varied cultures, even outside of Christ and outside of the gospel, were perfectly comfortable with this state of being, which shows that there is something truly unique about our place and point in time that we receive that kind of reaction even at the mere mention of it, right? And so there's talking about that has to be done, and this actually plays in with any discussion about marriage. A good friend of mine, a priest that I know, he keeps a standing discernment committee in his parish for those who are discerning holy orders, monasticism, or marriage, right? So if you come to the priest and say, I want to get married, you have to meet with the discernment committee and you have to tell them how you discerned marriage, right? Instead of just assuming that it's the default state. And we do, right? And if God's calling you to marriage, perhaps God is calling most people who will listen to this to marriage. God bless you. But it's not true of all of you. And we at least have to ask the question, is this actually what God is calling me to? Or is there something else? And in fact, if you do a deep study on the Christian view of marriage, I'm convinced that you will come to a very robust understanding of Christian singleness as well by virtue of that. Um, St. John Chrysostom found this to be the case. It's in his homilies on marriage that the crowd accuses him of trying to make all their sons into monks. It's while he's talking about Christian marriage that he's being accused of trying to turn Christian men into monks. And he's like, that's not what I'm saying at all. I'm just talking about the life of holiness. And there's one common call of holiness that we all have, but this one common call has many streams. And we have a duty to determine where we are called to. And sometimes walking in obedience to that vocation is uncomfortable or painful, right? And this is why we have to cultivate the courage of fortitude, of courage, right? To be able to walk truly according to the plan that God has set before us. So it's not so much a conference on, well, will I be a priest? Will I be a deacon? Will I be a nun, or will I be a layperson? There are many callings within the church, and we need to provide space and education to give people the ability to discern with God their place within the life of the church. Because if we're all a hand or we're all a foot, whatever, drawing on St. Paul's analogy, we're not a fully functioning body.
Yeah. I think it's a good sign for John Chrysostom that his preaching on marriage got the same response that Jesus' preaching on marriage did, which is, if
Oh
this
yeah,
is true, then who should get married?
why would anybody get married? I mean, that's the other thing too. Marriage is not an entitlement. Marriage is not easy. Marriage is a means of holiness. And if you're not comfortable thinking it under, within that framework, well then, my brother in Christ, you should not be married, or my sister in Christ, we should not be pursuing marriage, right? And so, but this is true of everything. This is true of the priesthood. Bishop Klein famously said that, well, famous to me at least, he said, nobody enters discernment for the right reasons. And he's talking about discernment to the priesthood. Nobody goes to seminary for the right reasons, not a single person. But with transparency, with the work of the Holy Spirit, with honesty, and letting Christ take his scalpel to our souls, we can leave discernment for the right reasons. And we can go on to those things that God has called us to, trusting in the working of the Holy Spirit, the operation of grace in us. And so I think that's true of all the Christian life. We probably have a two-dimensional view of our calling in God, and we actually have to sit there and examine the narratives we've inherited a little bit, because God might be calling us to something truly extraordinary. And I don't mean that in a way to entice people. I mean that obedience to God is the most extraordinary thing we could do. That's the divine life. That's participating in the all holy Trinity, right? That's the life of God and the soul of man, is through humility and obedience. And so sitting down and thinking, how much of this is me, and how much of this is actually what God has called me to, is just something which is so lacking in the contemporary Christian ethos, just in the zeitgeist of our culture in general. And so we need things like this, and we need more so priests who are qualified to do this kind of work of discernment with the people who are entrusted to our care. And I say this as someone who's probably the least qualified. We have a gal in our church who said, I want to maybe discern religious life. And I said, that's amazing. I have no idea how to do that. I have like not even the slightest idea. I'm not a monk. I'm not a woman. I don't know what that looks like, right? And so it really revealed to me my ignorance, and that I had to learn more. And also, I just needed to be upfront about the fact that this is ultimately the work of the Holy Spirit, and we need to engage with Him in that work for the good of our souls and for the good of the souls around us.
Yeah, so there's so much that I want to touch on here. I think one is the kind of high view of vocations that we're talking about, the high view of marriage. Another, especially in the American context, it's always been a distinctive of the Anglican view compared to other Protestants. I even think, I love American history. That was my major in undergrad, and I'm reading a lot about in the 1750s the petition to get a bishop. And one of the main worries of people in New England was if there was an American bishop installed, he would make it harder to get divorces
Mhm.
because Americans were used to getting divorces, but in England, it was almost impossible
Yeah.
because the high view of marriage in the Anglican tradition. So
Yeah.
Dr. Samuel Johnson, who was like a priest who was very influential in Connecticut, had to write a bunch of defenses of our view of
Mhm.
marriage
Yeah.
in order to convince people to be okay with a bishop.
Yeah.
um,
It's
but
nice that human nature doesn't change that
no,
much. Yeah.
not at all. Especially Americans.
Yeah, we
Americans
love
will
it.
always be a little, yeah, probably based on that. But that really is at the base of it is an insistence on our doctrinally on the objectivity of these vocations and the objectivity of and the high calling of vocations in a way.
Yeah.
So what again? Somebody came to you. They were like, "I want to join religious life," and you said that you didn't really know much at the time. What would be the first step for somebody? I mean, maybe go to this conference, right?
Sure.
Especially if you're in the West Coast. But what would be the first steps for somebody who's watching this and they're considering religious life? What would you say now?
First thing I would, and I think this is the first step for any first step in our vocation has to be one of humility. I have a lot of conversations with young men who feel called to holy orders, right? And I'm now starting to have more conversations with individuals who may feel called to religious life. And it's so easy for things which are entirely tertiary to become conflated with what it means to walk in those vocations, right? So when you're discerning the priesthood, you're thinking about the altar and the vestments, the incense and the singing, and everybody looking at Father, right? Or if you're discerning monasticism, maybe it's the robes, maybe it's the silence. I'm a big silence guy, right? I I love it. That's why I can't be in the monastery. It would not be a sacrifice to me. It would be entirely self-serving. And maybe it's the books or the idea, whatever. There's all these things which can become conflated with the idea, which is not the thing itself. And so we have to strip our minds of anything we can use to lift our souls up in any kind of like self aggrandizing, self glorifying way, and acknowledge that we are trying to follow after Jesus, right? Who girded his waist and washed the feet of his disciples. And that we are trying to do the same way. It is ultimately an act of service and healing to the other, and that's true of all our vocations. All our vocations have to be for the sake of others, right? Um, that's just what it means to be a Christian. And if you struggle with that, I apologize. Speak to your priest. But so I think that's the first step. I think the second one is praying, and having a real dialogue with God about the fears that inevitably arise. I think anyone who's doing serious work, any kind of discernment, truly, you're going to be filled with anxiety and fear, and you have to give that to God, because any act of obedience to God will be accompanied by sacrifice. It will. Um, if you believe you're being obedient to God and it costs you nothing, sorry to be the one to break it to you. You are not obeying God, right? Like that's just it. And so that's true of the priesthood. That's true of fatherhood. That's true of marriage. That's true of monasticism. It will cost you and it will be painful, right? And so that anxiety will be there and it should be there and it must be given over to God. Um, a question, right? So now we've given these things to God. We've talked to God. We've prayed. Um, how do we know when God is speaking to us? And so that was the question I was left with. And so I called a friend of mine who's a monk, and I asked him how they do their discernment. And he says the question that his abbot asks people who are inquiring and discerning is God answering your prayers? That's the question they ask them. And I love that because how do you answer that, right? And the idea is, right, it's a very Jewish question, if I'm being honest. It's great. It doesn't have an answer, but he the idea is God is always answering our prayers. The issue is whether or not we are attentive. Are we attentive to the work of providence, which we see every single day? And if we are not attentive to the hand of providence, if we are not attentive to the leading of the Holy Spirit, of actual grace, of God acting upon me, which he does quite regularly, right? I just don't notice it. If we're not attentive to it, what's the point of asking him to lead me anyways? What's the point of asking for a sign anyways if I'm just going to keep my eyes shut to it, right? And so that's the other thing. Do I even take notice of God when he acts in my life? Because if I'm being perfectly honest, I probably don't, right? And so there's a moment of not so much introspection of looking inward at ourselves, but really looking outward and seeing what God is doing around us and in our lives, and seeing, am I taking notice of the path that God is laying out in front of me, right? And then I think once we are comfortable with obedience, right, which is essential to religious life, once we are comfortable with the sacrifice, which is essential to the Christian life, um, and once we are actually doing the work to hear from God and act according to the ways that He's leading us, then we can do the practical things. I think the spiritual has to come first, then the practical, then maybe inquire at a religious community, speak to your priest, speak to your bishop. Perhaps they have resources for you. And when you go to those communities, if you go to those communities, I was talking with an abbess about this. Like, what would you do, right, when you're encouraging women who are doing discernment? She says, well, part of traditional monasticism is not so much called to a way of life, you're also called to a place, right? Same thing is true of the priesthood, you're called to a place. And so when you go into those institutions, in those places, asking God, is it here, Lord? Right? You want me here, Lord? Right? We Christians are incarnational. We can't escape place. Place is essential to our understanding of the holy life, right? And so I think that's it. And if you don't find a place, perhaps that's not the kind of calling you're called to. There are single lives which are not monastic lives, right? Um, there are people who live lives which are celibate, which are not monastic. And then finally, the last thing I would say is, again, we have to resist the urge about being too simplistic or binary in our approaches to vocation, right? Where we say, okay, am I called to singleness or am I called to marriage? Right? St. Augustine reminds us that it's not that simple, and he draws our attention to the order of widows in the New Testament. The Order of Widows was a monastic institution in the New Testament, right? These are single women who are serving the church in a consecrated life. They have given, in a consecrated way, they've given themselves to a life of celibacy, and they are exercising a kind of ministry within the life of the church. But he points out you cannot be a widow if you're not first married, right? And so what this means is that they had a true vocation to marriage, which and then gave way to a true vocation of widowhood, right? And both of these were vocations that God called them into. Both of them were means of holiness. And so to say, like, oh, the monastic is more holy than the married person, or vice versa, right? Pick your side of the Reformation. One's going to say one or the other. uh, St. Augustine says that it can be either or, right? For those of us who are good Protestants, we can think of Catherine von Bora, right? uh, had she not become a nun, she never would have met Father Luther, right? She never would have become married, right? And so our vocations can actually be in service to future vocations, and we can't take that off the table. Perhaps God's calling you to monasticism. Perhaps it's not right now. Perhaps God is calling you to marriage, but perhaps you or your spouse will die, and that will lead to a kind of monasticism. Like my wife knows, as soon as she's dead, I'm heading to the hills. I'm off to the monastery, right? And so this our vocations can build on each other and interpenetrate each other, and that's really what holiness is supposed to do. And so Dr. Peters is really good at this. You can't make it look one single way. You rather have to be obedient to God and what He has called us to, right? And following, as best of our ability, the wisdom of the church, how providence is laid out, how these things are ordinarily done, and how it manifests in our life, that we then discover our idiosyncratic, unique vocation, right? I think we will waste a lot of energy and we'll have much heartbreak if we are trying to force our calling to look a certain way when there is more freedom in a radical openness to what God has called us to, with all the highs and lows, all the joy and all the pains that is accompanied by. We recall again St. Augustine. St. Augustine says, love God and do what you will, right? By the constraint of loving God, by making that the lens by which the sieve that all things are pushed through, is actually what opens up the horizon to all possibilities. If everything I do is through the lens of, is it out of love for God, I will never sin, right? And so that constraint is actually what makes all possibilities holy, right? Uh, the sad reality is I don't do everything out of love for God, not yet, anyways. But by doing it that way, there actually is no fear in walking in any direction. Each one can be a means of holiness to me. And so, like Father Thornton said, there can be almost like a holy experimentation of trying on devotions and discernment and walking a certain way and letting the great shepherd like guide and direct our souls into the place that he has providentially prepared for us.
Yeah, I think I just couldn't help but think this whole time about a story I remember hearing about Catherine Desmartins, who is the wife of Peter Martyr Vermigli. She was originally kind of forced as a child, as a young woman, into the monastic life. Ended up being convinced of the Reformation. Fled to Strasbourg, where she met Peter Martyr Vermigli, and then followed. And they got married. Then followed him to Oxford, and they had, I think, about a dozen children. Unfortunately, passed away before reaching adulthood. And I can imagine her thinking in the back of her head at least once, is this because I wasn't supposed to be a mother or wasn't supposed to be married? But what I think was even more, what God ended up doing was while Peter Martyr Vermigli was at Oxford, she started a um, outreach ministry to women who had lost children and
Mhm.
had huge crowds of women and like an enormous circle, and was so beloved that he ended up being, well, also a long history in this, but she ended up being buried with, I'm forgetting who the patron saint of Oxford is, but people put her grave right next
Yeah.
to, I think it's I'm gonna forget, Oz. It's like Osweudu or something like that. But anyway, she ended up having a very successful ministry to women who had lost children
Wow.
because of that roundabout
Great.
life that she ended up having, which I always thought was beautiful, and I couldn't help but think about that. You
Yeah.
probably seek different vocations throughout your life and don't even realize which ones uh, God is going to use you for it at some future date.
Yeah.
So yeah, is there any other details about um, the conference? I believe it's called and Consecrated.
Yes, so the conference is called Called and Consecrated. It's hosted by the Diocese of San Joaquin, which is where I'm canonically resident. We're bringing in a number of speakers. We're trying to be as broad as we can, right? So we'll bring in a couple speakers from different kinds of monasticism. Someone to speak about priesthood, someone to speak about the diaconate, but also people talking about lay ministry in the church, how those are not. Consolation prizes, how like lay ministry is actually essential to the life of the church. And so we're trying to keep it as holistic and broad as we can because, again, we want to resist simply saying, well, this is how you serve God, and then putting the most convenient means in front of you. I would love if there are a bunch of new priests in my diocese. Unfortunately, I don't think that's the calling of God, right? And so um, you can take a look at the website. All that information will be on there. It's November 24th through 26th. That's the week before Thanksgiving. Um, I don't really know what else I can say about it. I really hope that it's impactful.
Yeah, and you said it's going to be held by the Diocese of San Joaquin. So is it going to be in San Joaquin, like the conference
Yes,
physically?
yes. So it will be in San Joaquin. It'll actually be at the cathedral in San
Okay.
Joaquin. I should say the proto cathedral. We're currently raising funds to building all kinds of things at the moment. But what is currently functioning as the proto cathedral, Emmanuel Anglican Church in San Joaquin. So the idea is this is pan ACNA.
Mhm.
This isn't just for those in San Joaquin. It is hosted by the Diocese of San Joaquin, but our speakers, other than me, are not from the Diocese of San Joaquin, right? We were bringing out representatives from all the various parts, the ACNA and REC,
Mhm.
to come in and speak about what it means as a province to do the hard work of discernment and finding the part of God's vineyard that He wants us to be laboring in.
Yeah, I love that. Anything I can do to encourage that more, I would love to. I'm sure I'll have you on here again. This was a great conversation. You could convince me to let you speak for another 2 more hours if you had something to talk about. I just loved hearing you go through all those different issues. Is there any parting words before we wrap up?
Uh, I think I would say that the Christian life is simple, but it is not easy, and it takes a level of effort, right? This is something that divines within the Anglican tradition say, but this is also what Saint Simeon, the new theologian, the great Greek theologian, says that faith is the worker, is the laborer that has been placed in our souls by that great carpenter, Jesus Christ. but he has to work, and we also have to provide him with the tools to do that work, which are righteous deeds and virtue. And so we have to walk out our callings with fear and trembling. And so um, do not give in to the sin of presumption. Do not believe that you could be passive in the faith. Do the hard thing. Kill the parts of you that are even good if it shows more of God's glory. It's not an easy task, but it is a worthwhile task.
Great. Thanks so much for that. If you're interested, I hopefully have a link in the description to the conference website and more details in there. I'll also have to ask, I always have to say this at the end of every video. If you liked the video, actually like the video, hit the little thumbs up. That helps a lot. And if you want to see more stuff from Young Anglican and Anglican Renaissance, you can hit the subscribe button and hit the little bell, and you'll get notified every time I upload a new video. You can check out more information at anglicanrenaissance.org. And if you want to support, you can always support over at younganglican.locals.com. Thanks so much for watching, everybody, and God bless.